Did you know that the single most common study habit, highlighting and then rereading the notes, is actually the biggest waste of time for many students? Now, cognitive scientists call this the illusion of competence. Your kid reads the page, it looks familiar, and their brain basically tricks them into thinking that they've mastered it. But unfortunately, when the test hits the desk, their mind goes blank. Today, I'm going to give you the keys to unlock your child's long-term memory using tools that you won't find in a standard classroom. Now, if you want to start seeing real progress, you can't afford to miss this episode. So dive right in. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Young, OG tutor extraordinaire, founder of theliteracykeys.com, and most importantly, mom of a dyslexic daughter. Welcome to my podcast, where you'll discover ways to unlock your child's reading potential. I'll share tips, strategies, and war stories that have happened along the way, because everyone deserves to be able to read. So let's get started. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Literacy Keys. I'm Tracy Young, your host, a certified Orton Gillingham tutor, and mom to an amazing dyslexic daughter. Today, we're going to pull back the curtains on studying, and you remember those days, and talk about how to study, but more importantly, how to study effectively. Because let's face it, it's not about seat time. Now, as someone who has spent a lot of time with kids who have dyslexia and ADHD, let me start by sharing that most students, they're actually never taught how to study. So much less how to study effectively. We basically go tell them, go study, but we don't give them a manual for their brain. Today, we're going to dive deep into 5 tips on how to study effectively. We're going to look at specific science-backed ways to move the information from short-term memory into long-term memory, because it's got to hit long-term memory for them to remember it. And because this is the Literacy Keys, we're going to talk about how to tweak each tip for our dyslexic and neurodiverse learners who need a different approach. So go grab a cup of coffee, maybe even a glass of wine, and let's dive in. The first tactic that I want to talk about, I'm going to call it the anti-cram method. Now, we're talking about that cramming hangover. We've all done it. And we've seen our kids do it. Some much more successfully than others. They stay up till 2 a.m., they pour facts into their heads, and they pass the next morning. But poof, the information has vanished the following day. That's not what I'm talking about. I want the opposite of that. Now, some cognitive scientists call this the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Basically, in a nutshell, our brains are designed to forget things that don't seem important. And let's face it, understanding the mitochondria in a cell is not important to the majority of our kids. If you only see a piece of information once or twice, then what happens is that your brain says, I don't need to remember this. And that is what happens a lot of times with our kids, whether they pass the test or they don't pass the test. So let's talk about a tactic, something that they can do that's going to help solve this. So this anti-cram method is a way of reviewing information at different intervals. So instead of studying for 3 hours on Sunday night, when the test is on Monday, you want to have your child study for 20 minutes on Sunday, the week before, 15 minutes on Tuesday, 10 minutes on Thursday, and so off. It's the repetitive nature of reviewing information that helps put it into long-term memory. And this is necessary because we want to let the brain know that the brain has to retain the information. Now let's talk about a modification that we can use for our kids. For a lot of our kids, time is abstract. And if they can visually see or feel the repetition, it helps that it stick. So, for example, you could use a visual calendar. It's a physical wall calendar, right? Maybe get one that's laminated so that you can take and use an erase, a dry erase to write and then erase from it. Each subject gets a different color. So, for example, history is blue and then math is red or whatever color. Let your child pick, or a student, because we can be talking about teenagers here, pick the colors. Now, when they plan their week, they draw a blue dot on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, right? So the blue pattern then provides a visual reminder and anchor. Another thing that they can do, or actually, they could do both of these together. Use a shoebox or a Tupperware, any rectangular, heck, use a pot if you want, any rectangular container. And you're going to divide it into 3 sections. One is going to be for every day. The second is going to be every other day. And the third section is once a week. Have them create index cards, information they need to learn, to memorize. I know that's a scary word, but information that they need to learn in long-term memory. And they put all the cards into the everyday. If they get the card right, it moves to a different divider. So if they get it right, it goes to every other day. So for example, day 1, you start with all the cards in the everyday section. Questions on one side, answers on the other. As your child goes through these cards, the ones that are correct are placed in the every other day section. The ones that get wrong stay in the everyday section. Then on day 2, your child starts with the pile on the right. They go through the cards in the every other day section. The ones that are correct are placed in the once a week section. The ones that are wrong go into the every day section. Then once they're finished with that section, then they move to another section. So, for example, on day 2, they finish up the every other day, they go to the every day, right? Go through them and sort the index cards accordingly. What's great about this is it makes the progress tactile because they're physically moving their knowledge through space from one section, compartment, into another. When they have all the cards in the once a week section, have them turn them over and start answering them Jeopardy style, in which you read the answer and then you have to provide the question. So, by having it both ways, it ensures that your child doesn't have a false sense of knowing the information. Let's now talk about the second thing that they can do. I'm going to call this the brain workout. Now, most students try by rereading their notes and highlighting their textbooks. But unfortunately, research shows that this is the least effective way to learn. It creates that illusion of competence. The words look familiar, so the student thinks, oh, I know this. Yeah, I've come across it, and so forth. But remember, familiarity is not the same as mastery. Mastery is when it's automatic and you can provide the information maybe within 3 seconds. There's no hesitation. Now, how can we modify this slightly for our kids? You want to force the brain to pull the information out. Kind of think of it as a workout for your child's brain neurons, right? The harder it feels to remember something, the more the memory is being cemented. Get a blank sheet of paper, have them write down every single thing that they can remember about the subject. Let them go on. The book is closed. They're not peeking at anything, no Googling. They're just writing down everything that they can think of. Once they've captured everything on paper, then they open the book to see what they've missed. So they're not starting from the stuff that they know. They're really focusing on what they don't yet know. How we can take and modify that? So many of our kids have a massive gap between verbal intelligence and writing ability. If you ask a dyslexic student to write down everything they know, it's possible that they'll freeze or revolt because the act of spelling and handwriting consumes all of the brain fuel or the brain energy. So there's nothing left. The modification that we can do is let's use the voice memo app on their phone. Long ago, we used to have a tape recorder. Now all we have to do is whip out the phone, voice record, and you're all set. Allow your child to pace around the room, which involves kinesthetic processing, and share out loud all of their knowledge. Then take the voice to text tool to see those thoughts turn into words. They could even play it back later on, right? It's like having your own tutor. Hearing their own voice play back the information engages an auditory loop, which is a massive strength for many dyslexic learners. All right, good so far? 2 tactics. Let's talk about the third one, the switch up. Sometimes we think that the best way to study is what's called block practice. You do all your math, then you do all your science, right? But actually, the brain learns better when it's slightly confused. What do I mean by that? So let's say many students do 10 of the same types of problems at a time. Unfortunately, this creates a sense of false mastery because they need to mix up the different types of problems or subjects within the study session. This is actually called interleaving. I feel like it should be called interweaving, but what do I know? If a student is practicing math, don't let them do 20 multiplication problems in a row. They need to do a multiplication problem, followed by a division problem, and then move on to a word problem. Because this forces the brain to constantly determine the type of problem that they're solving. It's engaging the brain more. The more we engage, the more they think about, the more they learn, and it goes into long-term memory, right? We don't want any possibility of the brain going on autopilot. An analogy, I love analogies. So an analogy might be going from driving on a straight highway without any traffic to driving on a busy city street with traffic lights, pedestrians, and lots of turns, right? You got to really focus in more and pay attention. Now, how can we modify this for our kids? A lot of our kids struggle with transitions. It requires a lot more energy to focus on a new topic. So we need to be able to modify that interleaving into a physical activity that helps minimize this struggle with transitions. What we can do is we can create stations around the house, around their room, wherever it is that they study. For example, math could be at the kitchen table. Vocabulary could happen in the living room. History might be at a standing desk or a high counter. When it's time to switch the subjects, they physically move their body to a new location. So, this encoding of a new environment helps the brain associate specific information with the physical feeling or view, which will make it easier to retrieve later. They need to picture where they were when they were learning the information in order to help them remember. Let's face it, sitting at the same desk for 2 hours can feel like a prison sentence for many people, especially if you have to go to the bathroom, but that's a different subject. Physically moving to a new station, even if it's just the other side of the room, can provide the novelty effect and brain break that they need. It increases blood flow and resets their focus so that the next 20-minute block is much more productive. Let's say they study at the kitchen table and you don't want them roaming around the entire house. Have them switch chairs, right? Let's say they have a desk in their room and that's where they study, right? Have them take a prop and a different prop for each subject. They take and they place the prop in front of them so that it's a visual anchor, and then they change it when they switch subjects. So, math, for example, could be a bobblehead, while science is a lava lamp. And then when they're trying to retrieve the information, they threw the associations. Okay, science, I'm studying about mitochondria. Let me visualize the lava lamp. And so, what we're doing is we're creating those synapses in our brain for easier retrieval. Now, let's talk about tactic number 4. I'm calling this one dual coding. Textbooks are great, but our brains are wired to process images and words in different parts of the brain. So when we use both, we double the chances of the information sticking. And that's what we want. So, for example, have your student have a blank piece of paper, a sketch note, doodle pad, something. If they're learning about the water cycle, then don't just write the definition of evaporation. Have them draw a little sun, maybe with a straw sucking up the water. Basically, the weirder the image, the more it's going to stick. This is not about being the next Picasso. This is about really anchoring it visually, and by drawing it, we're using the kinesthetic or motion and everything else, right? So now let's talk about a modification that we can do. So many dyslexic thinkers are big picture thinkers, and they are highly spatial. So we need to leverage that strength. Manipulatives will leverage that. If they're studying the parts of the cell, don't just draw it, maybe build it, right? Take a cork and then toothpicks, right? Something, anything in a junk drawer, go to the dollar store. It's amazing what you can find there, right? A rubber band can be a cell membrane, a dried noodle could be the mitochondria. Think back to when you were in kindergarten. They used to have us do this stuff all the time. If, for example, they're studying history, take a piece of yarn across the floor, across the desk. They still want room to write or whatever, and have them place physical objects on that yarn. Maybe it's a toy soldier, a tea bag, a quill, right? Something that's going to jog their memory so that they're touching history. All of this makes it multi-layered memory or memorization. So now let's talk about the last thing, teaching it. The ultimate test of whether you know something is if you can explain it to someone else. How many times have we thought, yeah, I understand it, And then you go to explain it and you're like, wait, what was it that I wanted to say? And you got to refer back to what you were reading. So this is named after Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, yeah, whatever, who is famous for making the complex simple. Now, that I like. So, how can we modify this for our students? Well, you have your child sit down and teach you the concept. But here's the rule: they can't use jargon, right? Stuff that a small child wouldn't understand. So, if, for example, they say something like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, you need to ask them to explain what that means. What's a powerhouse? What's a cell? Mitochondria, what does it look like? Well, anything. Have them explain it so that a child would understand it. If they stumble or can't explain it in plain English, then you've uncovered the knowledge gap, right? Where the brain is lulled into thinking that they know it, but in actuality, if they can't teach it, they don't know it. And that's exactly the point that they need to go back and relearn it. Mm. So, how can we take and modify this even more for our kids? Well, perhaps have them stand up and use large motor movements, right? Because that can be incredibly grounding. Get a large whiteboard or even a smaller one that they hold, right? And let them play the expert. Draw diagrams, lecture to you, explain it out loud, either to you, their siblings, their stuffed animals. I don't care. Put an orange and a grapefruit in front of them. Hmm? The act of standing, reaching, and drawing while they're speaking out loud engages visual, auditory, kinesthetic, right? It's the OG of study habits. So the more senses that we can engage in the studying, then when they need to retrieve it, it truly is in long term memory and they can access it. Now, I've been saying, oh, yes, long term memory and everything else. What does that mean? If I ask you, what color is a polar bear? Most of you, hopefully, are going to say white. Well, you weren't thinking about polar bears. You probably don't live in an area where you see polar bears, right? But yet we all knew the polar bears are white. Majority, whatever. I'm not talking about exceptions or anything else, right? What happened there is that information was stored in long term memory. You retrieved it when you needed it. And now that you no longer need it, it goes back into long term memory. Well, that's the same process that we need to have happen with our kids when they're studying. So let me give you another bonus, right? Let's say we call this the pre flight check. A lot of times, executive functioning skills are the biggest hurdle for our kids. They sit down to study and spend 45 minutes trying to find the right pen or the website that they need to use for their assignment. We've all been there. Now, before they start, have them spend 5 minutes either listing or saying out loud when they are finished, what will that look like? It's not about the amount of time spent on something. It's about what it will look like when I complete, for example, 5 practice problems and record a voice memo about the Krebs cycle. That, by the way, is the chemical reaction that happens in the mitochondria that turns food into energy. But I digress. Now, how can we take this study tactic and modify it even further? Use a visual timer. Something where like that disc disappears as time goes by, because this makes the vanishing of time, that concept, visible. And you can even try body doubling, right? Where you don't have to help them. All you do is you sit in the room, maybe read a book, pay the bills, right? Your presence can help regulate their nervous system to help them stay on task. All right, so those were the different tactics that they can use to study more effectively. Now, I'm going to be honest, you're probably thinking that this feels overwhelming. And maybe you're saying, Tracy, I can barely get them to sit down for 15 minutes, let alone build a 3D model. And I get it. So here's my challenge to you for this week. Do not try all 6. Pick one. Maybe it's the voice to text brain dump. Maybe it's some dry erase markers and a whiteboard. Maybe it's a brown paper bag that you let them cut up and use markers with. It's about small wins because that's how we're going to change the trajectory. Their brain isn't broken. It just needs a different set of keys to unlock the door. So if you're listening to this and realizing that your high schooler needs more than just a few tips, if they're drowning in reading and writing demands of high school, reach out. My one-to-one educational therapy is specifically designed to give older students tools to master these skills for themselves, because that's the ultimate goal, independence. You can find me at the Literacy Keys. And remember, you're doing a great job, and you're not alone. I will see you next week. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to the Literacy Keys podcast. Follow us on social media, and most importantly, tell a friend. See you next week.